Welcome back to the Engage podcast. Ryan Argenta here. Today I'm with Brendan Cantwell. He's the chairman of the Government Affairs Committee. He's also a 330 FO in New York. Brendan, welcome back. We had you on about 2 years ago after the wrap of the Legislative Summit. So welcome back. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ryan.
We're actually at ALPA National's studio in Vallow Park outside of Washington, D.C., and we're actually midstream here at the MEC meeting. But last week, you just concluded the Legislative Summit for 2025. Zooming out a bit, what is the Legislative Summit? Who's involved? And what are the priorities there?
Yeah, the Legislative Summit is the cornerstone event for ALPA Government Affairs. It happens every year in June. It's an opportunity for pilots from across ALPA carriers to come to Washington, D.C. and really get an inside look at what ALPA does in D.C. with their legislative and political agenda and priorities. Pilots from across several different carriers. We typically bring about 50 Delta pilots to come to D.C. The first couple days are spent in advocacy training, where pilots will participate in panel discussions, get policy updates on ALPA's legislative and political priorities. They'll be briefed by members of Congress. Several members came and gave us keynote speeches this past week, and they kind of walk out of there prepared to be good pilot advocates for the Airline Pilots Association. The event culminates on the final day with a trip to Capitol Hill, where they'll get an opportunity to meet with their members of Congress, their House of Representatives member, and their senators to advance ALPA's priorities and really be that front-line advocate for the Airline Pilots Association. Getting some real buy-in from actual pilots, talking to members of Congress, I think is really impactful. And for all the folks that come, I hear great feedback that they really enjoy the event. I can't recommend it high enough that pilots that are interested should absolutely attend if they'd like.
Yeah, I agree. I went 2 years ago and got the full experience, and I feel it's hugely valuable. And that experience alone helped me understand how government affairs works, how big ALPA works, how the Delta MEC works, and really how pilot priorities, even pilot ideas, are expressed at such a national level. There's topics that pilots feel it's such a high level thing, like state sick or single pilot ops. We've heard of E63 and things that are pretty high level. Like, how does a pilot influence that? And that is done at the Legislative Summit. How do you get invited, or how do you raise your hand to go? Because any Delta pilot can go. You put your name in and then you're selected by GA. It's a fairly straightforward process, but how does that work?
So I'll start with that. Again, the summit's usually every June. Registration opens up in March with an email from ALPA. We typically try to get folks on a first-come, first basis. We'd like to get first-timers there as well, because I think there's some advantage there. But as you see that registration come through your email, please encourage you to sign up and attend if it's something that you're interested in. As far as, hitting the hill and why it's so great to have pilots up there, we're at a real advantage as the experts in our field, right? No one can talk about reduced crew operations better than we can. Nobody can talk about, the stuff we see on the line better than pilots can. And that's impactful with members of Congress. They're met with so many different issues from a day-to-day basis. They have to know about almost everything, and that's impossible, right? From water policy, farming policy, all the way to aviation. So it's such an advantage, and it's really helpful to members of Congress to hear directly from the experts, and we're the experts in this case. We are absolutely the experts when it comes to aviation safety. So to have that time advancing our priorities and our policies in front of members of Congress really makes an impact. And I think it's such a key role that the government affairs team does, not just the staff side, but also having pilots involved as well.
Yeah, I agree. It was really interesting and impressive, really, to sit in my congressman's office and be welcomed. And you're in uniform, which sucks to be in the double-breasted in June in D.C., but huge amounts of respect. And it was surprising at first when, your congressman is asking you as that expert. And of course, you're well-spoken, well-rehearsed in the priorities, but they really just want to hear from you, the pilot, in your own words. There's no script, there's no agenda, really. It's just talking to your congressman, their staff, give and take, and a back and forth.
Yeah, I think last week's summit, 170 meetings were completed with members of Congress, and 70 of those meetings were with the actual member of Congress, not just staff. So that's a really impactful amount of meetings that got completed to get the agenda moving and to get members of Congress updated on our issues. We're at a real advantage too, because members of Congress spend a lot of time on airplanes, right? They travel to and from Washington, D.C. twice a week for a lot of them. So they're very interested in what we have to say. They like talking about flying. They like talking about the issues that we care about. So we really have a captive audience when we come to the Hill. And I think the pilots that attend this summit are surprised to see that and to see how engaged the members of Congress are on our issues.
Yeah, it definitely shows that priority, right? Instead of like, oh, you're going to meet with staffer X, they're actually there. And as far as members of Congress traveling, right, it's when topics like reduced crew operations come up, you can really pitch it back to them of like, would you feel comfortable flying a DCA to LA and there's one pilot or no pilot, which I know is one of the topics. So maybe we just dive in there. What were the priorities for this year?
Yeah, I think fortunately we have on that issue alone a lot of support in Congress because they are surprised and sort of taken aback to hear that idea, especially, the scrutiny that our industry is getting at the moment. They're very surprised to hear that there are efforts out there of taking a pilot out of the flight deck. So we engage with them. We try to tell personal stories of a situation we've had in the cockpit that could become troublesome with one less pilot there. It's very easy for a pilot to kind of tell that personal story, and it does have an impact. So we were up on the Hill advocating on that issue, specifically asking members of Congress to sign on to a joint letter from both the House and the Senate to Secretary Duffy and the DOT, asking the DOT and FAA that they defend against any attempts to roll back those safety measures and remove a pilot from the cockpit. I think a lot of this is starting in the international field. In the first attempts to get a pilot out of the cockpit will happen at ICAO. They're the ultimate sort of international organization that oversees flying. And it's so critical that we have someone defending us at ICAO. And this letter will urge Secretary Duffy and the FAA to really be our defenders there and make sure that any efforts to roll back those safety measures and to take a pilot out of the cockpit are stopped at ICAO. So hopefully, we'll get members to sign on to that letter. And that's what some of the pilots at the summit were doing. We're asking their members of Congress to sign the joint letter.
And pilot involvement is pretty critical, even if you don't go to the summit, right? Because we see the emails come through of call to action, or if you go to ALPA's website, it'll say, click here. And it's really seamless. It doesn't take very much time. They're generally pre-filled emails. They already know your representatives, and you can obviously change it or modify, add whatever you'd like, but it takes a mere seconds. But maybe a plug there, like a call to action to have your representatives sign on to these campaigns, right?
Yeah, there are a couple open calls to action currently. And again, I encourage all the pilots listening to go do that. Like Ryan said, it's a very quick and easy process. Log into the ALPA website. It pre-populates everything and will send it to your member of Congress right away. And those are impactful because members of Congress like to hear from constituents and like to know what their constituents are concerned about. And it also helps when pilot advocates go into one of these offices and meet with a member of Congress or their staff. That member of Congress or staff member will know the constituents are concerned about this particular issue, right? They'll look into, have we heard about this particular issue from anyone? And having those calls to action as a backup reaffirms our position and is really helpful. The current one right now that's on the ALPA website deals with the Mental Health and Aviation Act, which was introduced last month in the House of Representatives. We're expecting a companion bill to be introduced in the Senate as well. Good news on that today. That advanced out of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. So that's a positive step to getting it to the House floor. And hopefully with the Senate companion bill, that's legislation that we can get back or get past. That deals with, I think all of us are acutely aware of the barriers to getting mental health treatment for our profession. This legislation would cover controllers as well. There's some real concerns about what would happen with medical certification if we ask for help. And the legislation sort of goes back to the FAA's Aviation Rule Committee that was completed last year and co-chaired by ALPA. It put forward 24 recommendations on what the FAA can do to kind of unwind some of those barriers. And it's been slow to implement, right? And so this piece of legislation would require the FAA to implement all 24 of those recommendations within 2 years. So we've got some positive momentum there. And again, folks listening, I encourage you to go complete the call to action on the ALPA website.
Yeah, it would be surprising that Congress wouldn't support pilot mental health as part of this package. And it sounds like by them amending the pilot mental health bill, it's a direct result of the work that you've all put in and pilots have put in at the legislative summit. So people are like, oh, I go to the summit, or this is happening in the background while I'm flying airplanes. What's the tangible result? And this is one of them.
Yeah, for sure. At the summit last week, two of the members of Congress that came and spoke to us were Sean Casten and Pete Stauber, who were the bipartisan co-sponsors and leads on this legislation in the House. So we heard directly from them on why it was personal. Congressman Casten had a pilot in his district go through some mental health issues that motivated him to get involved and try to fix this. Congressman Stauber used to be a police officer, and when he was at his department, he got his start trying to help get mental health treatment and access for his fellow officers on the police force. So we got really good talks from both of them, and I think it motivated the pilots to really push forward on the Hill, on that Hill visit day. And when members of Congress hear directly from pilots on issues affecting them, it's impactful, and it does move the needle for them.
Yeah, and that's great to know. You talked about ATC modernization as a priority as well, and I think we've all felt the impact of that, especially if you've flown in Washington Center and of course, the meltdown in Newark. New York Center has some issues as well, and that's becoming part of the mainstream news at this point. What's the chatter there, and how did the summit help?
So Secretary Duffy and the Trump administration released their plan to modernize the entire air traffic control system. ALPA is part of a 50-member group called the Modern Skies Coalition. Across industry, labor, management, manufacturers, just almost any group having to do with aviation signed on to this coalition to encourage members of Congress to continue this work on ATC modernization and make sure it gets across the finish line. We've sort of been here before with Next Gen and some of the upgrades that we're hoping to get completed in years past, and we didn't get quite across the finish line. But obviously the recent attention on all the issues and close calls we're having has really motivated members of Congress and the administration to get that done. It will be an expensive, complex process, and Congress will have to sort of drive that process and lay out the plan. So we'll be involved in advocating for that and making sure it's done properly and safely. But yeah, it was nice for pilots, again, to go into these offices. And the members of Congress are exposed to this too, right? They're flying into D.C., and D.C. has delays almost every day now. And again, the Newark issues are on the news almost every day, so there's a lot of attention on it. But it was very helpful that the pilots could walk into the office and tell their own personal story about what they're dealing with with air traffic control and the issues we see every day. So again, that's going to be a longer process, right? That's going to take some time and some work from Congress and the administration. But of course, ALPA will be involved in that.
I know that's been a priority. In fact, last year, a congressman asked me, so what's the craziest airport you've ever flown into? And I said, LaGuardia. And he was surprised. And, I think he expected some third world small airport. And I said, no, LaGuardia.
Starting some of those conversations with members of Congress maybe a year or two ago, when specifically in New York, we had those really critical controller shortages, and Delta and other airlines had to roll back some of the flying they were doing in and out of the New York area. And I can remember for the first time on our paperwork, our dispatch releases, seeing dispatcher remarks that they were adding gas due to controller shortage, and that was the first time I'd seen that. And again, that costs the airline money, which they'll pass on to passengers. And members of Congress are interested to hear that, it's such a issue that it's impacting our operations. And now we're seeing that on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, for sure. Past priorities, right? So we go to the summit, and it doesn't just stop at the summit, right? Summit's over and okay, GA goes on vacation, although you deserve to. But this is a year-round process, government affairs at all the levels. We have people, boots on the ground in DC, advocating for pilots around the clock. We have non-pilot staff members and lobbyists that we talk to. If you look at our last episode on State Sick with Jeff Pavlak and David Martin, have a listen to that because they are the pros in the field, as are you, but you're also a pilot. Go ahead.
Yeah, we're very lucky to have the team we do at the staff level for government affairs. They are there on Capitol Hill working with Captain Ambrosi every day, meeting with members of Congress and professional staff, meeting with members of the administration, FAA, every day talking about our priorities. So it's such a critical part of the operation for ALPA. And it's really, I think, one of the more respected groups in DC. We have such a great professional staff that members of Congress come to ALPA if they have any aviation-related question. We're really the first and best source for anything related to aviation, and a lot of that has been built by the staff, so it's an important and critical part of that. They're up there every day defending our profession and promoting our agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. I do want to ask, what is the latest on the pilot retirement age 67?
So that was an issue that was debated and discussed in 2023 and 2024 as the FAA went through its reauthorization process and Congress passed that legislation. It was not included in the final version of the bill that was signed by President Biden. It's certainly something we keep an eye on and engage on, but at the moment, Congress dealt with the FAA reauthorization bill and the issues involved in that piece of legislation last year.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. Brendan, what do you need from Delta pilots? How can they get involved on all levels? What do you need from us?
Just engagement and interest in the issues we deal with on Capitol Hill. ALPA has a great program called the District Advocate Program. Any pilot can participate in that. It's an easy online training course that sort of explains to them the process of ALPA government affairs, educates them on our issues, takes them through how they would set up a meeting with their member of Congress back home in district and prepare them for that job. It's a great program. Again, if folks are interested, they can reach out to the committee through a DART or sending me an email and I can get the training sent to them online. But that's such a critical aspect of what we do with government affairs. We have our excellent staff and we have some pilot advocates that are working regularly in DC, but it's so critical to have pilots meet with their member of Congress or senator back home in the district. That's really when you can have an impact. The members of Congress will listen to their constituents, especially when you're back home in the community. So that's a great program to get involved in. The calls to action we talked about already and why they're so important and an easy thing to really help out the government affairs effort. And obviously something I'm very passionate about is ALPA PAC, right? That is the way we build these relationships. Being involved in the PAC, every pilot should give to the PAC, and I encourage folks who don't give to the PAC to start giving. And if you do give, I would recheck how much you give and maybe think about increasing that amount. We try to talk to pilots a lot during the new hire briefings, and when you first get to Delta, you hear about the PAC, and you're overwhelmed with a lot of what's going on, so you don't necessarily think about it or remember it, and you just sign up. But we've had some great contract improvements. Maybe you've moved up to a different category of airplane or upgraded, and it's time to up that amount. But it's such a key, important part of what we do here. It's so critical that pilots are driving the narrative about the issues we care about and not management or manufacturers. And the way we do that is building relationships. And the best way to build relationships is through ALPA PAC.
Totally. You know, to see your enthusiasm and your passion level jump when we were talking about the PAC. I want to zoom out just a hair and talking about the PAC. What does it stand for starters?
Political Action Committee. Again, it's a voluntary thing that all pilots can participate in at ALPA. No union dues are used for the PAC. That's against the law. So it's a voluntary thing. You can go on the ALPA website and sign up. You can do a check off from your paycheck if you'd like to. You can do a one-time credit card contribution. You can do a recurring credit card contribution as well. All that can be done on the ALPA website or the ALPA app.
ALPA dues are not used for that, and the results gained, the relationships built from the PAC are so important. And you know, you'll see people with the bag tags, you know, the Benke Circle and the President Circle, and there's all these different tiers. And so yeah, you get some stickers and a cool bag tag, but the benefit of that donation is hugely impactful.
Yeah, and I think at the moment at Delta, just under 40% of our pilots give to ALPA PAC. So I encourage folks to ask their seatmate there to participate and get involved. And it really does get us in the door and get us time with these members of Congress to talk to them and to build those relationships and to support members of Congress. You know, we call them pilot-partisan. We just focus on the issues that we are interested. We don't get outside of anything aviation or really labor related. So it's just our champions that we support, and we're allowed to build those relationships over time, and they're there for us in each Congress when we need help, and it's so critical. So I encourage everybody to get involved with ALPA PAC. The money and how it's spent is decided by the PAC steering board, and that's made up of pilots across several different airlines. So it's pilots involved in deciding where that money goes and making sure that those members of Congress or candidates that we support are going to engage on our issues and be supportive of our issues.
Okay. So it sounds like it's a well-managed program, and so we're not just out willy-nilly spending money, or people conjure images of what happens on the Hill or in D.C. and spending the money frivolously.
Yeah, I think I heard just today that the last election cycle of all the candidates or members of Congress that we supported through ALPA PAC, it was a 95% success rate. So that shows you that we're working with folks that are successful in their campaign and helping them get elected to Congress and make sure they are going to be pilot-partisan members of Congress.
Yeah, that's impressive. So back the PAC, calls to action. Go to the Legislative Summit. Look for those emails that come from the ALPA president each spring. Look for that. If you have any questions, send a DART to the Government Affairs Committee, and you'll get a response there.
The district advocacy program I can't recommend enough, right? Again, having pilots in every congressional district that can be the trusted aviation expert back home in that district is so critical. So I encourage pilots to get involved that way. Again, it's a quick online training course that we can help get you set up in, and you'll get updates quarterly from ALPA on priorities we're advancing. There's web calls regularly to update folks on what's happening in Capitol Hill. So it's a really great program that I recommend all of our pilots participating in.
Awesome. Brendan Cantwell, Chairman of the Government Affairs Committee, thanks so much for everything you've done and do for us and for pilots. And thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
You bet.
You're listening to Engage, the podcast for Delta pilots. Follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform, and receive notifications when a new episode is available.